The stars had always seemed peaceful to humanity. For centuries, they had looked up at the night sky and wondered if they were alone. They built telescopes and sent probes into the darkness. They dreamed of meeting other beings who might share their curiosity about the universe. When the answer finally came, it arrived not as a whisper, but as a shadow that blocked out the sun. The Valkyrie Ascendancy fleet translated into Earth's solar system on a Tuesday morning. 300 warships, each one larger than anything humans had ever built, appeared near Jupiter's orbit. They hung in the void like mountains made of metal and malice. Their arrival was detected by every telescope, every satellite, and every frightened pair of eyes that happened to be looking up at the right moment. High Emissary Kethvaros stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Dominion, and watched the blue planet grow larger on his viewing screens. He was tall and thin, with gray skin that shifted colors when he felt strong emotions. His crest, a series of bony ridges that ran from his forehead to the back of his skull, lay flat against his head in a sign of complete boredom. He had done this 17 times before. 17 species, 17 worlds, 17 surrenders. The process was always the same. Arrive with overwhelming force. Make contact. Offer terms of peaceful integration. Watch the primitives realize they had no choice. Accept their submission. Move on to the next world. It was tedious work, but someone had to expand the glory of the ascendancy. His aide, a younger Valkyrie named Sorn, approached with a data tablet. The translator programs had finished analyzing human communications. The results were unremarkable. Humans were fractured into hundreds of small nations that constantly fought each other. They had nuclear weapons, but had somehow avoided destroying themselves. They had only recently begun to colonize their own solar system. Kethvaros made a sound that might have been a laugh. These creatures were still playing with rockets, while his people had been crossing galaxies for 10,000 years. He ordered a message sent to Earth. The message was simple. It announced the arrival of the Valkyrie Ascendancy. It demanded that human leaders send representatives to discuss the terms of peaceful integration. It promised that cooperation would be rewarded and resistance would be punished. The humans responded within 6 hours. They would send a delegation. Ambassador Elena Vasquez was not the obvious choice to represent humanity. She was 63 years old, a former schoolteacher from Buenos Aires who had entered politics late in life. She had gray hair that she refused to dye and lines on her face that told stories of laughter and grief in equal measure. Her husband had died 12 years ago in the colony wars, killed when a supply ship exploded near Mars. She had 2 grown children and 4 grandchildren. She liked gardening and old books and had never wanted to be famous, but the world leaders who chose her knew something that the Valkyrie did not. Elena Vasquez was the most stubborn person any of them had ever met. She had spent her entire life fighting for things she believed in, even when everyone told her she would fail. She had lost many battles. She had never stopped fighting. The shuttle that carried her delegation to the Valkyrie flagship was small and fragile compared to the alien vessels around it. Elena sat in her seat and looked out the window at the massive warship growing larger with each passing second. She felt fear, of course. Only a fool would feel nothing in this moment. But beneath the fear was something harder, something that had been growing inside her since the moment she first saw those ships appear in the sky. The Valkyrie guards who met them at the docking bay were impressive in a cold, mechanical way. They stood 8 feet tall and carried weapons that hummed with energy. They did not speak. They simply gestured for the humans to follow. The walk to the council chamber took 15 minutes. Elena used the time to observe everything she could. The ship was clean and efficient. There were no decorations, no art, no signs of individual expression. Everything existed to serve a purpose. Even the Valkyrie themselves moved like parts of a machine, High Emissary HFY was waiting for them in a room that seemed designed to make visitors feel small. The ceiling was impossibly high. The walls were bare metal. A single raised platform held the emissary's chair, forcing anyone who spoke to him to look up. Elena had seen this trick before. Dictators throughout human history had used similar tactics. The thought almost made her smile. HFY began speaking. His voice was translated by a device that made it sound flat and emotionless. He talked about the glory of the ascendancy. He talked about the benefits of integration. He talked about how other species had flourished under Velthari guidance. Then he got to the terms. Humanity would disarm completely. All weapons would be destroyed. Human governments would be dissolved and replaced with Velthari administrative units. A percentage of the human population would be selected for labor assignments on other worlds. Human resources, including food, water, and minerals, would be shared with the ascendancy as needed. Human culture would be preserved in museums, but would not be allowed to interfere with integration. In exchange, the Velthari would not destroy human cities. They would provide technology to improve human lives. They would protect humanity from other threats in the galaxy. HFY called this peace. Elena listened to every word. Her face showed nothing. Her eyes never left the emissary's face. When he finished, silence filled the room. The Velthari expected the humans to beg, to plead, to offer desperate counter-proposals that would be rejected. This was how it always went. Instead, Elena asked a question. Her voice was calm and clear. It carried through the vast chamber without any sign of fear. And if we refuse? HFY felt his crest rise slightly in surprise. He quickly forced it back down. In 3,000 years of conquest, across 17 species and countless worlds, no one had ever asked that question. They had always known the answer without needing to hear it. He leaned forward in his chair and let a small smile cross his thin lips. "Then, we will demonstrate what refusal costs," he said. "And you will change your minds." Elena nodded slowly, as if she was truly considering his words. Her eyes moved across the room, taking in the guards, the weapons, the overwhelming power that surrounded her on every side. Then she looked back at HFY. "I understand," she said. "We will need time to discuss this with our governments." The emissary granted them 7 days. It was Morse. Most species surrendered within hours. As Elena walked back to the shuttle, one of her aides whispered urgently in her ear. They were outgunned, outmatched. They had no choice but to accept. Elena said nothing. She simply kept walking, her eyes fixed straight ahead. She was already thinking about what came next. The Velthari chose Prometheus Base because it was small. 3,000 people lived on that frozen moon, carving out an existence in the ice and rock. They were farmers, mostly, scientists, families who had wanted a fresh start away from the crowded cities of Earth. Children played in the underground gardens where vegetables grew under artificial lights. Old men sat in the common areas and told stories about life back on Earth. Young couples planned weddings and talked about the future. None of them knew they had been selected to. High Emissary HFY announced his decision on the 3rd day. The humans had not yet responded to his terms. They were still debating, still arguing among themselves, still believing they had options. He decided to show them the truth. The message reached Earth at the same moment it reached Prometheus Base. In exactly 24 hours, the Velthari would destroy the colony. Any humans who wished to leave could do so. This was a gesture of mercy. This was what happened to those who hesitated. Elena was in Geneva when she received the news. She stood in a room full of the most powerful people on Earth. Presidents, prime ministers, generals with medals on their chests. They all looked at her as if she might have an answer. She did not cry. She did not scream. She simply closed her eyes for a long moment and thought about the 3,000 people on that distant moon. She thought about the children in those underground gardens. Then she opened her eyes and got to work. The evacuation ships launched within 2 hours. Every vessel that could reach Prometheus base in time was sent. But everyone knew the math. The ships were too slow. The distance was too great. They might save a few hundred people. The rest would die. On Prometheus base, the colonists made their choices. Some crowded onto the evacuation ships, pushing and shoving for a place. Others refused to leave. An old farmer named Thomas Park stood in the doorway of his home and told the evacuation officers that he had spent 30 years building this life. He was not going to run from aliens who thought they could take everything he loved. He was not alone. Nearly 1,000 colonists stayed behind. They gathered in the main dome and waited for the end. Some prayed. Some held their families close. Some simply sat in silence, watching the stars through the transparent ceiling. When the Valkyrie ships appeared in orbit, Thomas Park was standing at the observation window. He watched the first missiles launch. He watched them streak down through the thin atmosphere like falling stars. He did not look away. The destruction of Prometheus base was broadcast across every human communication channel. The Valkyrie made sure of it. They wanted humanity to see what happened to those who hesitated. They wanted the message to be clear. Elena watched the feeds from a room in Geneva. Around her, generals pounded tables and demanded immediate retaliation. Politicians argued about surrender terms. Religious leaders called for prayer and calm. Everyone was shouting. Everyone had an opinion. No one had a solution. She stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the sun was setting over the mountains. The sky was painted in shades of orange and red. It was beautiful. It was peaceful. It was everything the Valkyrie promised to protect if humanity simply gave up. She thought about Thomas Park, the old farmer who had refused to run. She thought about the children in those underground gardens. She thought about her husband, dead now for 12 years, killed in a war that seemed so small compared to this. Then she turned back to the room and raised her hand for silence. It took a long moment, but eventually the shouting stopped. Everyone looked at her. They saw something in her eyes that made them afraid. Not afraid of the Valkyrie. Afraid of her. Elena spoke quietly, but every word was clear. She had a plan. It was dangerous. It was desperate. It would require sacrifice that none of them could truly understand. But it was the only chance they had. First, she would contact the Valkyrie. She would tell them that humanity accepted their terms. She would ask for a formal ceremony to sign the surrender documents. This would buy them time. Second, during that time, every hidden resource humanity possessed would be activated. The secret shipyards in the asteroid belt. The weapons caches buried on a dozen moons. The sleeper cells already in place on Valkyrie-occupied worlds. For 20 years, paranoid military planners had been preparing for exactly this scenario. They had built a shadow fleet. They had trained soldiers in secret. They had planned for the day when an enemy too powerful to fight would arrive at their door. Third, and this was the part that made everyone in the room go silent. Someone would need to die. Elena explained it simply. The Valkyrie expected humans to be like every other species they had conquered. Weak, divided, easily frightened. If humanity simply attacked, the Valkyrie would crush them. But if humanity could prove that they were different, that they were willing to sacrifice everything for freedom, then other conquered species might rise up too. The Ascendancy could not fight a war on 100 fronts. They needed a symbol. They needed a martyr. They needed someone to show the galaxy that humans would rather die than submit. The room was silent for a long time. Finally, a general named Morrison spoke up. His voice was rough. His eyes were wet. He asked the question that everyone was thinking. Who would volunteer for something like this? Elena smiled. It was a sad smile. A tired smile. The smile of someone who had already made peace with what came next. She had buried her husband 12 years ago. She had raised her children. She had lived a full life. And she had made a promise to herself on the day those Valkyrie ships appeared in the sky. Never again would she stand by while innocents died. She told them she would go. She told them she would sign the surrender. And she told them exactly what would happen next. The message to the Valkyrie was sent that night. Ambassador Elena Vasquez would return to the Valkyrie flagship in 3 days. She would formally accept the terms of peaceful integration. She would sign whatever documents they required. Kethveros received the message with satisfaction. He had known the humans would break. They always did. The destruction of Prometheus Base had served its purpose. He ordered preparations for the ceremony. He wanted it to be grand. He wanted the other conquered species to see how easily humanity had been brought to heel. He had no idea what was actually coming. On Earth, Elena spent her final days with her family. She did not tell them the truth. She held her grandchildren and told them stories. She walked in her garden one last time. She wrote letters that would be delivered after she was gone. On the night before she left, she stood alone on her balcony and looked up at the stars. Somewhere out there, the Valkyrie fleet was waiting. Somewhere out there, the ashes of Prometheus Base were still cooling. She thought about the old farmer who had refused to run. She thought about the 1,000 colonists who had stayed behind. They had shown the Valkyrie something that the aliens could not understand. Some things were worth dying for. Tomorrow, she would show them again. The shuttle left Earth on a cold morning in December. Elena sat by the window and watched her planet grow smaller behind her. The blue oceans, the white clouds, the brown and green patches of land where 8 billion people were holding their breath. She wondered if she would see it again. Then she pushed the thought away. There was no room for doubt now. Her delegation was small. 2 aides who knew the plan and had volunteered anyway. A translator who was actually a communication specialist with equipment hidden in her jewelry. And Marcus Chun. Marcus was 42 years old. He had been a soldier for 20 years. He had a wife and 2 daughters back on Earth. He was quiet and unremarkable. The kind of man who could walk into any room and be forgotten within minutes. He was also the bravest person Elena had ever met. They had talked for hours before the mission. She had given him every chance to back out. She had told him that no one would blame him. She had reminded him of his family, his children, everything he would be leaving behind. Marcus had listened to all of it. Then he had smiled and said something she would never forget. He said that his daughters were the reason he had to do this. Because if he did not, they would grow up as slaves. They would work in Valkyrie labor camps. They would never know what freedom felt like. He would rather die giving them a chance than live watching them suffer. So here they were. 2 people who had chosen to sacrifice everything. Flying toward an enemy ship to play the most dangerous game in human history. The Valkyrie flagship was even more impressive up close. It stretched for miles in every direction, a city made of metal floating in the void. Smaller ships moved around it like fish around a whale. Weapons bristled from every surface, enough firepower to destroy a planet. Elena looked at it and felt nothing but cold determination. The docking procedure was the same as before. Guards met them at the airlock. Scanners swept over their bodies and belongings. The weapon that Marcus carried was made of materials that did not exist in any Valkyrie database. It passed through every check without raising an alarm. The walk to the council chamber was long. Elena used the time to steady herself. She thought about the people of Prometheus Base. She thought about her husband. She thought about every human who had ever died fighting for something they believed in. She was about to join them. Hi. Emissary Ketharos was waiting on his raised platform. His crest was fully displayed now, a sign of triumph and satisfaction. Around him stood the highest officials of the Valkyrie Ascendancy. They had come to witness this moment, the conquest of humanity. The 18th species brought into the fold. The ceremony began with speeches. Ketharos talked about the wisdom of human leaders. He praised their decision to choose peace over destruction. He promised that integration would bring prosperity and purpose to the human race. Elena stood and listened. Her face was calm. Her hands were steady. Inside, her heart was racing. When the speeches ended, a document was brought forward. It was written in both Valkyrie script and human languages. It outlined the terms of surrender in precise detail. The disarmament, the dissolution of governments, the labor assignments, everything that humanity was giving up. Elena took the pen they offered her. She looked at the document for a long moment. Then she signed her name at the bottom. The Valkyrie officials made sounds of approval. Some of them applauded. Ketharos smiled his thin smile and rose from his chair to approach the human delegation. Elena stood up from the signing table. She smoothed her jacket. She turned toward the door as if preparing to leave. Ketharos called out to her. His voice was almost friendly now, almost warm. He asked if she felt relieved. He asked if she understood that she had made the right choice. Elena stopped walking. She stood with her back to the emissary. She did not turn around. Her voice was quiet when she spoke. Quiet but clear. She said she was relieved. She said she had been worried about something. Ketharos asked what she had been worried about. Elena's answer was simple. She said she had been worried that he might actually mean it, that the Valkyrie might actually want peace, that she might have been wrong about them. The emissary's translator struggled with her meaning. He asked her to explain. Elena finally turned around. She looked directly into his eyes. For the first time, she let him see what was really there. Not fear, not submission. Something else entirely. She said that peace meant something different to humans. It meant freedom. It meant dignity. It meant the right to live without fear. What the Valkyrie offered was not peace. It was slavery with a prettier name. Ketharos felt his crest begin to rise in anger. He opened his mouth to respond. The shot came before he could speak. Marcus Chun had drawn his weapon in a single smooth motion. The guards had not even begun to react. The plasma bolt crossed the room in less than a heartbeat. It struck Elena Vasquez in the back. She fell without a sound. Her body hit the floor of the council chamber and did not move. For a frozen moment, no one in the room could process what had happened. The Valkyrie stared at the fallen human. The human aides screamed in apparent shock. Marcus stood with his weapon still raised, his face showing nothing but cold purpose. Then chaos exploded. Valkyrie guards fired from every direction. Marcus Chen died before he could take another breath. His body was torn apart by a dozen energy beams. He collapsed next to the woman he had just killed. The remaining human delegates were seized and dragged to the floor. They were screaming, crying, begging for mercy. They claimed they had not known. They claimed Marcus had acted alone. Ketharos stood over Elena's body. His crest was fully raised now, not in triumph, but in confusion. His hands trembled slightly. In 3,000 years of conquest, nothing like this had ever happened. Humans had not simply surrendered. They had not simply resisted. They had done something that made no sense at all. They had killed their own leader. He ordered the footage broadcast immediately. Every Valkyrie world, every conquered species, every corner of the galaxy. He wanted everyone to see what humans really were. Treacherous, unstable, dangerous. He thought this would break them. He thought this would show the galaxy that humans could not be trusted. He thought he was winning. He was wrong. On Earth, Billions of people watched Ambassador Elena Vasquez die. They saw her fall. They saw the Valkyrie guards kill Marcus Chun. They saw the chaos and confusion on the alien flagship. Then they saw something else. A message appeared on every screen. A message that Elena had recorded before she left. A message that explained everything. And for the first time in human history, the entire species stood up together. Elena's face appeared on every screen on Earth at the exact moment she died. The recording had been timed perfectly. While the Valkyrie were broadcasting their version of events, humanity was watching something very different. She looked tired in the video. Tired, but calm. She was sitting in a simple room with a plain wall behind her. She was wearing the same clothes she would wear to her death. She began by apologizing. She apologized for the deception. She apologized for the fear that people would feel in the coming hours. She apologized for the burden she was about to place on every human being alive. Then she explained everything. The Valkyrie had promised peace, she said. They had used that word many times, but their peace was a lie. It was slavery with a smile. It was chains made to look like gifts. The destruction of Prometheus Base had proven what the Valkyrie really wanted. They wanted obedience. They wanted submission. They wanted humanity to bow down and accept their place as servants. Elena said she could not accept that. She said Marcus could not accept that. She said that somewhere in the human heart, there was something that refused to kneel. Something that would rather die standing than live on its knees. So they had made a plan. She explained it clearly. She and Marcus would go to the Valkyrie ship. She would sign the surrender. Then Marcus would kill her. Not the Valkyrie. Her. A human killing a human. The ultimate sacrifice to expose the ultimate lie. Because the Valkyrie would broadcast it. They would show the galaxy their version of events. They would try to use her death to prove that humans were treacherous and dangerous. But humanity would know the truth. Humanity would see that their ambassador had chosen to die rather than truly surrender. Humanity would understand that this was not a betrayal. It was a battle cry. Alana's voice grew stronger as she continued. She spoke of the secret preparations. 20 years of building. 20 years of hiding ships and weapons and soldiers in every corner of the solar system. Humanity had always known this day might come. They had always feared that something would arrive from the stars with too much power to fight. So they had prepared, quietly, secretly, in places the Valkyrie would never think to look. Those preparations were now active. The Shadow Fleet was ready. The weapons were armed. The soldiers were waiting for their orders, but none of that would matter without unity. Elena spoke directly to every nation on Earth. She spoke to the countries that had been enemies for centuries. She spoke to the leaders who had spent their careers fighting each other. She spoke to every human being who had ever thought their differences were more important than their similarities. She begged them to put all of that aside. The Valkyrie had conquered 17 species. She said, they had won every time because their enemies were divided. Because fear made people turn on each other. Because it was easier to surrender alone than fight together. Humanity could not make that mistake. She asked them to fight. Not for her, not for revenge, but for the children who would grow up as slaves if they surrendered. For the farmers on Prometheus Base who had died because they dared to exist. For every human being who had ever dreamed of reaching the stars and finding something wonderful waiting there. The Valkyrie had shown them what the galaxy truly held. Power that crushed the weak. Empires that fed on the labor of conquered peoples. A universe where might made right and mercy was just another word for control. Elena said humans could accept that universe. They could bow down and hope for kindness from their masters. They could teach their children to serve and obey and never dream too big, or they could fight. She said she knew which choice her people would make. She said she had faith in humanity. She said she had always believed that when the moment came, when the real test arrived, humans would rise to meet it. The video was almost over now. Elena's eyes were wet. Her voice trembled slightly, but she did not look away from the camera. She had one last thing to say. She spoke to her children, to her grandchildren, to the family she would never see again. She told them she loved them. She told them she was proud of them. She told them not to grieve for too long because there was work to be done. Then she smiled, Dot. It was a real smile. Warm and sad and full of hope, all at the same time. Dot, she said goodbye. The video ended. For a long moment, Earth was silent. 8 billion people sat in their homes and their offices and their schools, staring at screens that had gone dark. 8 billion hearts were beating. 8 billion minds were processing what they had just seen. Then the response came. Dot. It started small. A protest in Buenos Aires, Elena's hometown. People flooded into the streets with signs and flags. They chanted her name. They sang songs that had not been sung since the last great wars. It spread quickly. Paris, Tokyo, New York, Moscow, Beijing, Cairo, Mumbai. Every city on Earth erupted with the same message, the same refusal, the same rage. Within hours, every government on Earth had issued a joint statement. It was broadcast on every frequency, aimed directly at the Valkyrie flagship. The statement was simple. It acknowledged Elena's sacrifice. It honored Marcus Chun and every colonist who had died on Prometheus base. It declared that the surrender documents were void, that humanity did not accept the Valkyrie terms, that the killing of Elena Vasquez was not an assassination, but an act of war. Then it made a promise. You wanted to know what happens when humanity refuses. The statement said, now you will find out. Across the solar system, ships emerged from hiding. They rose from asteroid fields where they had been camouflaged as rocks. They launched from underground hangars on moons that the Valkyrie had not bothered to scan. They appeared in places that should have been empty. It was not a large fleet by Valkyrie standards. Maybe 100 ships. Maybe enough to take on a fraction of the enemy armada. But it was a start. And on every one of those ships, crews looked at images of Elena Vasquez and Marcus Chun. They remembered the people of Prometheus base. They thought about their families back home and the future they were fighting for. They were scared. Of course, they were scared. They were facing an enemy that had never lost. But they were also angry and determined, and united in a way that humans have never been united before. On the Valkyrie flagship, High Emissary Kethvarus watched the human broadcasts with growing confusion. His aide Soren stood beside him, crest twitching nervously. This was not how it was supposed to happen. The death of their leader should have shattered human morale. The broadcast should have turned other species against them. Everything should have proceeded according to 3,000 years of precedent. Instead, humanity was fighting back. Instead, the conquered species on a dozen worlds were watching human transmissions and whispering among themselves. Instead, something new and dangerous was spreading through the galaxy. Hope.k, e to h single quotes, VAROS did not understand hope. He understood power. He understood fear. He understood the mathematics of conquest that had served the ascendancy for millennia. But he was beginning to realize that humans did not play by those rules. He ordered his fleet to advance. He would crush this rebellion before it could spread. He would burn Earth to ash and make an example that the galaxy would never forget. He was confident in his victory. He had no idea what he was about to face. The war lasted 11 years. It was not the war that High Emissary Kethvarus had expected. He had planned for a quick campaign, a few decisive battles, the destruction of human military capacity followed by the occupation of their Worlds. Simple, clean, efficient. Nothing about fighting humans was simple or clean or efficient. First battle took place near Mars. The Veltari fleet outnumbered the human defenders 10-1. By every calculation, it should have been over an hour's dot. It lasted 3 weeks. Human ships were smaller and weaker than Veltari warships. They could not match the enemy in firepower or shields or speed. So they did not try. Instead, they fought dirty. They hid in asteroid fields and launched surprise attacks. They rammed damaged ships into enemy formations. They used nuclear weapons as mines and filled space with debris that clogged Veltari engines. When the battle finally ended, the Veltari had won. They controlled the space around Mars, but they had lost 40 ships. 40 ships that they had expected to lose 0. Kethvaros declared victory and moved on. He did not understand what had actually happened. He had just learned the first rule of fighting humans. They did not stop when they were losing. They did not surrender when the odds were against them. They kept fighting until there was nothing left to fight with. And even then, they found ways to continue. The war spread across the solar system. Earth built new ships faster than the Veltari could destroy them. Factories that had made cars and consumer goods were converted to produce weapons. Scientists who had studied stars turned their minds to developing new technologies. Children who had played video games learned to fly combat drones. Every human being became part of the war effort. Not because they were forced, because they chose to be. Because Elena Vasquez had shown them what they were fighting for. Because the people of Prometheus Base had shown them what surrender really meant. By the end of the first year, the Veltari controlled most of the solar system. They had glassed 3 more human colonies. They had killed millions of people. They had declared victory 17 times. And still the humans kept fighting. In the second year, something unexpected happened. The Kethrani, a species that had been conquered by the Veltari 800 years ago, launched an uprising on their homeworld. They had seen the human broadcasts. They had watched Elena's final message. They had remembered what freedom used to mean. The uprising failed. The Veltari crushed it with brutal efficiency, but it spread resources thin. It showed cracks in an empire that had seemed unbreakable. By the 5th year, 3 more conquered species had rebelled. The Veltari ascendancy was fighting on multiple fronts for the first time in its history. Ships that should have been hunting human survivors were instead suppressing revolts on the other side of the galaxy. Kethvaros aged badly during those years. His crest, once a symbol of pride, now lay flat against his skull in permanent exhaustion. He had stopped making predictions about when the war would end. He had stopped declaring victories that meant nothing. He had started to understand what he was facing. Humans were not like other species. They did not calculate the odds and make rational decisions. They did not give up when resistance became illogical. They held on to hope with both hands and refused to let go, even when hope was the only thing they had left. And somehow, impossibly, that hope was contagious. The war turned in the 8th year. Human scientists had captured a Veltari ship intact. They had spent months studying its technology. They had learned its secrets. They had built something new. The first human ship with Veltari-level weapons launched from a hidden shipyard near Neptune. It was called the Elena Vasquez. More ships followed. Hundreds of them. Then thousands. Humans had always been good at building things. Now they had the technology to build things that mattered. The battles started going differently. Human fleets no longer ran and hid. They stood and fought. They took losses that would have broken any other species, and they kept coming back for more. In the 10th year, human ships crossed the boundary of the solar system for the first time. They followed the Veltari home. What they found surprised them. The ascendancy was crumbling. Rebellions had spread to over half of the conquered worlds. The mighty empire that had seemed invincible was tearing itself apart from within. Humans had not just fought a war. They had started a revolution. The final battle took place above the Veltari homeworld. Kethvaros commanded the defense himself. He was old now. His gray skin faded to almost white. He had watched everything he believed in collapse around him. He had seen an empire that had lasted 10,000 years, brought to its knees by a species that should have been enslaved in a week. The human fleet surrounded his world. They had the power to do to the Veltari what the Veltari had done to Prometheus Base. They could have glassed every city. They could have killed billions. They could have taken revenge for every atrocity, every death, every moment of suffering. They did not. Instead, they sent a message. A simple offer. Surrender and live. Join the new galactic community as equals. Help build something better than the empire that had come before. Peace. Real peace. Not the twisted version that the Veltari had always offered. Peace that meant freedom for everyone. Single quotes, VAROs, read the message in silence. His aides waited for his response. They expected him to fight to the death, to choose destruction over surrender, just as he had always demanded from others. He surprised them. He was tired. So tired. He had spent 11 years learning that everything he believed was wrong. That power was not the only thing that mattered. That there was something stronger than fear. He surrendered. The war was over. 20 years later, a school was built on the rebuilt Prometheus colony. Children sat in bright classrooms and learned about the history of the galaxy. They learned about the Veltari ascendancy and its fall. They learned about the rebellion that had freed 12 species. They learned about the war that had changed everything. And they learned about Elena Vasquez. A teacher stood at the front of the classroom, an old woman with gray hair and kind eyes. She had lived through the war. She had lost friends and family to Veltari weapons. She had spent decades helping to build the peace that followed. She told her students about the woman who had walked onto an enemy ship, knowing she would never walk off. She told them about the message that had united humanity. She told them about the sacrifice that had sparked a revolution. A student raised her hand. She was young, maybe 7 or 8, with curious eyes that reminded the teacher of someone she had known long ago. The student asked why Elena had done it, why she had volunteered to die, why she had not let someone else take her place. The teacher was quiet for a moment. She had asked herself that question many times over the years. She had read everything Elena had ever written. She had talked to people who had known her. Finally, she answered. She said that before Elena left Earth for the last time, the generals had asked her the same question. They had asked why it had to be her, why she was willing to give up everything. Elena had given them a simple answer. She had said that someone needed to show the Veltari that humans were not afraid, and someone needed to show humanity that they were worth fighting for. The teacher looked around the classroom at the young faces staring back at her. Human children. Veltari children. Children from 12 other species, all learning together in a school that would have been impossible 20 years ago. She smiled. Elena had been right. Humanity was worth fighting for. The galaxy was worth fighting for. And the peace they had built, the real peace, was worth every sacrifice that had been made to achieve it. Outside the window, the stars shone bright and clean. No longer symbols of conquest and fear. Now they were symbols of hope. The universe was wide and full of wonders, and humanity was finally ready to explore it.